2 a.m. Nevada. The wind howled like the sound of flesh being torn. Red sand blanketed the ground like a shroud for the dying. A creature was writhing in the throes of labor. No people. No light. No hope. A wild horse. Pregnant. Bleeding. Collapsing, as if she had just crawled up from the depths of hell, only to die. And then, a human figure appeared. Not a doctor. Not a savior. Just a survivor who no longer believed in anything. But in that moment, when their eyes met, something returned. Not faith. Not a miracle. But the part of his humanity he thought war and death had erased. You think a horse can't change the fate of a man? You think someone who's dead inside can never come back to life? You're about to witness the opposite. And this time, it will shatter everything you thought you knew about life, death, and loyalty. Nevada desert. 2 a.m. The sandstorm didn't howl. It screeched, like metal tearing through flesh. No stars. No moonlight. Only a moving wall of dust, swallowing both sky and ground in a blinding, bone-dry void. And in the heart of it all, a still, silver-gray form pressed against the cracked earth. But it wasn't a rock. Not a carcass. It was a wild horse. A mare. Still alive. Her eyes were wide open, unmoving. Her mouth slightly parted, as if she had screamed until nothing was left to scream. Her belly heaved violently. A life was about to emerge from inside her. But she herself was fading. No halter. No human tracks. Only a long streak of dried blood, dragged from the cliff's edge to where she now lay. As if she had crawled out of hell just to die, in silence. If you had stood there, witnessing that, what would you have done? No one answered. Because out here, in the land of the forgotten, no one passed by. No one stopped. Except for one man. The sound of tires grinding against rock broke through the silence like a stray gunshot. A truck door swung open and slammed shut immediately, trying to keep the storm out. But the sand still got in, through the eyes of the man who stepped out. The driver was Elias Crane, a former U.S. Army veteran, 3 tours in the Middle East. No wife. No kids. No friends. Just a weathered wooden cabin buried in the western mountains, where he had exiled himself for the past 11 years, after an explosion stole everything he loved. And what was left of his soul. Tonight, Elias hadn't meant to drive. He simply couldn't sleep. Or maybe, something inside him had stirred. He didn't believe in omens. Didn't believe in reason anymore either. All he knew was that something was waiting ahead. Then, the headlights swept across a shape lying motionless in the storm. At first, Elias thought it was a dead coyote. Then maybe just a rock. But as the truck rolled closer and the light hit harder, he froze. A horse. A mare. Pregnant. And dying. Elias Crane said nothing. Called no one. He just stood there, staring at the horse as if recognizing something too painful to name. He had seen that look before, in a field medic station, where a soldier lay legless, too far gone to scream. He had seen that silent collapse, in the eyes of those the world had forgotten. And now, it was here again, among the dust and decay, and a horse no one had ever bothered to ask what she had lived for. Elias stepped forward. Not fast. Not hesitant, but unstoppable. He knelt down, his hand resting gently on her trembling chest. She didn't flinch, didn't resist, didn't even shiver. Only one tear slid from her eye and fell onto Elias's hand. He held his breath, not because of the storm, but because that single tear shattered a door inside him, one he had locked shut for over a decade. Elias went still, then leaned down beside her ear, and for the first time in years, he spoke. "If you still want to live, then I won't let you die alone." This story didn't begin with survival. It began with a soul that had already fallen, and a man who thought he'd died in the quietest way possible. And you're about to witness something unbelievable. With nothing more than a fading gaze, a dying horse pulled a broken man to his feet, to face the wolves, the storm, and himself. Elias Crane wasn't the kind of man who rescued horses. He wasn't a good man either. He was simply the last one standing after a life had already collapsed. 11 years ago, when he returned from his final tour in Ramadi, there was nothing left to return to. His wife, Claire, died in a car crash on her way to pick him up from the airport. His daughter, Anna, just 8 years old, was in the back seat. No one survived. The crushed vehicle was pulled from the side of a mountain, the same day Elias set foot back in the U.S. All they gave him were 2 blood-stained friendship bracelets sealed in an evidence bag. After that, Elias cut the world off. He bought a wooden cabin in the Nevada mountains. No neighbors, no phone, no internet. Just one living soul shared that silence with him. Warden, an old Malinois, wounded in the first Kandahar operation, and by Elias's side ever since. Warden used to be a military dog. Now, he was blind in one eye. Spent his days lying still, listening to the wind, and waiting for Elias to breathe evenly at night. Elias didn't cry anymore. Not because he was strong, but because the tears were gone, like a well that had collapsed on itself. He no longer dreamed, no longer called anyone's name in his sleep. Only habits remained. Mornings, boil black coffee, no sugar. Midday, fire a few rounds at old targets behind the cabin. Night, 1 sip of whiskey. Just enough to forget for a few hours. And if you ask, why did you stop the truck when you saw that horse? The answer is, Elias didn't know either. It was just, in that brief moment when the headlights cut through the storm and revealed the body in the sand. He saw himself, lying there like that, unnamed, left behind, not because of guilt, but because there was simply no one left. When Elias lifted the mare into the truck bed, his spine screamed in pain, but he didn't stop. Solène was too heavy, and her belly was spasming. Labor had begun. He didn't know a thing about delivering a foal. No vet, no road to a hospital. Only one cabin, 8 miles away, hidden behind a canyon pass that had been washed out in a flood years ago. Warden barked from a distance, as if he could sense what was coming. Elias pulled the handbrake, climbed into the driver's seat, turned the truck around, and glanced into the rearview mirror. The mare's eyes, still open. She wasn't sleeping, wasn't thrashing, just staring at him, unblinking. That look, it wasn't animal. It was as if she were waiting for him to admit, "You've been here too." On the ground. And no one came. Elias didn't answer. He just hit the gas. The tires crunched over gravel. Dust kicked up behind them. What happens when a soul you've buried for 11 years gets awakened by a dying wild horse? The night wasn't over. Blood was still fresh. And if Solène didn't give birth in time, 2 lives would be gone before sunrise. The truck jolted as Elias drove over the first rocky trench. The mare lay motionless in the back, like a memory bound by the ropes of time. Warden, the old dog, sat in the passenger seat. He didn't bark. He just stared at Elias, unblinking, just like the horse had. Elias had never saved anyone. In war, he was trained to keep his unit alive by taking lives. And horses? No one had ever taught him anything about these creatures. With eyes sadder than any human's, the headlights blurred through dust. The dashboard clock read 2:53 a.m. Distance left, 7 miles. The sand curled behind them like a giant blade chasing them down. Solène was breathing fast. No groaning. No thrashing. Just a harsh, rasping breath, fractured into ragged bursts. Like a ticking countdown toward the edge of something final. And her belly convulsed. Once. Then again. Elias glanced in the rearview mirror. Each spasm landed square in his chest. Not out of fear, but memory. A memory of Clare, his wife. Gasping for air, clutching her stomach, blood spilling onto the leather seat of their family car. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. There was nothing in him ready for this. No training. No knowledge. No backup plan. Only one decision. If you want to live, then you don't get to die alone. That's what he'd said. And now, there was no turning back. In that moment, Elias was no longer a soldier who survived. No longer a hermit running from his past. He became something he hadn't been in years. A human being. In every sense of the word. The headlights hit the wooden door of the cabin. He slammed the brakes. Warden let out a low howl. No time to think. No time to shake. Just a life, maybe 2, suspended on the razor's edge between survival and annihilation. Elias leapt out and flung open the truck bed. Solène wasn't moving anymore. Her eyes still open. And he swore, in that split second. A single thread of light just went out inside them. He screamed, for the first time in 11 years. Not for help. Not for God. Just a raw, primal sound from a soul that refused to lose anything more. He lifted Solène with everything he had left. His left shoulder torn since combat. Spine fractured years ago. But he lifted. Even as his feet sank into the dirt. Even as his chest felt crushed from the inside. The old stable door burst open. The scent of dry hay, stale medicine, and horse blood swirled together. A distorted hymn for the forsaken. Elias laid her down. Covered her with an old military blanket. The same one he'd once used to shield a fallen brother under mortar fire. He placed his hand on her chest. Felt nothing. Then, a heartbeat. Soft, but real. And Elias sat down, back against the wooden wall, eyes closed, his hands still resting on the mare's chest. That night, a man who had rejected the entire world chose to stay. because of a soul who couldn't even say his name. And what Elias didn't know, inside Solène, a tiny heartbeat kicked for the very first time, as if to say, I won't let you die alone either. 3:17 a.m. Outside the cabin, the wind still howled. But inside the stable, there was only the sound of broken breaths, like a dull blade trying to saw through solid stone. Solène convulsed for the third time in an hour. White foam spilled from her mouth. Her neck stiffened. Her whole body trembled, soft and rhythmic, like a breathing machine about to stop for good. Elias knelt close. His left hand cradled her head. His right rested on her neck, where the pulse had faded into nothing more than a memory of a heartbeat. He had no idea what he was doing. No veterinary training. No emergency equipment. Just an old checkered scarf, the one Claire had tied around his wrist the day he left for his first deployment. He dipped it into the water trough and placed it across Solène's forehead. The cold water soaked down through her mane, dripping onto her throat. He tore a piece from his shirt, dipped it, and gently wiped her chest, her legs, every bruised and bloodied spot he could reach. She didn't cry out. She just breathed. Less and less. Elias pressed his ear to her belly. He didn't need to be a doctor to know something inside was fighting. A life was kicking, pushing, shifting, trying to break through. But Solène's body was slipping further away from life. He stood and grabbed the flashlight, shined it into her eyes. The pupils didn't react, but they were open, still watching. Someone was still in there, refusing to let go. Elias gripped the water trough with both hands and flung it upward. Water crashed down over the mare's back, splashing across his face. Solène jerked hard and let out a burst of air, laced with blood. Warden barked loud from the corner of the stall. The first time he'd made a sound in 2 days. The bark ripped through the silence like a battle cry demanding life back from the brink. Elias didn't know if any of this would help, but he couldn't just stand by. 11 years ago, he had stood by, watching his daughter's final breath through a hospital live stream. Stuck in traffic, too late to hold her hand. This time, he was here. And this time, he swore he wouldn't just watch. 4:12 a.m. Solène began to breathe harder, then weaker, then jerked violently, then still, back and forth like a tug of war. A silent battle between a mother's instinct and death breathing down her spine. Elias leaned his back against the wooden wall, sat close to the stall, placed his old gun on his lap, not to defend himself, but to keep his hands from shaking. He didn't speak. He just placed his hand gently on Solène's cheek and left it there, not because he was alone, but because it was the only thing left he could give to a soul that no longer had the strength to call out for anything. Warden crept up beside him, rested his muzzle on Elias's leg, didn't bark again, as if he, too, understood that tonight was the last chance, unless something changed. 5:06 a.m. The sun hadn't risen, but the wind had stopped. And in that eerie silence, Elias heard something. A kick. Another. Then a soft tremor, like a knock from inside a wooden box. Elias opened his eyes, held his breath, Solène lifted her head, just slightly. And for the first time since they met, she exhaled. Not blood, just breath. Warm. Alive. That night, Elias didn't sleep. He sat there, back to the wall, eyes locked on the mare's body. A man, a dog, and a soul about to be born, held on to life, with one promise, to stay. And on that first night, no one gave up. No one looked away. No one died. Only one soul slowly came back. From the other side, 5:48 a.m., a thin thread of sunlight pierced through a crack in the cabin roof. Lost and fragile amid the lingering cold wind, Elias sat against the wall, eyes wide open. His hand still rested on Solène's neck. His gaze hadn't left her belly since midnight. Her belly began to contract. This time, strong, unmistakable. No more scattered spasms. These were waves, deep, forceful, rising like an underground storm. She was going into labor. Right at the moment Elias had no idea what to do. No one beside him. No doctor. No manual. Just instinct, and a man who had already lost everything. Solène let out a low cry, stretched her neck, clenched her teeth. Her body began to push, one surge at a time. Each one ripping through her. Each breath stabbing through the chest of the man who watched helplessly. A burst of fluid spilled out. Then a foal's head emerged, still wrapped in its birth sac. Eyes shut. No sound. Just a limp, trembling form, born into dust and cold wind. Elias froze. Nothing had prepared him for this. Not war. Not the hollow years he lived like a ghost. But he moved. Without thinking. Without hesitation. With the same torn shirt he'd worn for 3 days, Elias wiped the foal's face. The slick membrane clung to its nose. He peeled it away with his bare hands. The foal didn't move. Didn't breathe. Didn't respond. Elias whispered, almost a prayer. You don't get to leave. Not now. Not after your mother gave everything to bring you here. He blew air into its nostrils. Took a dry cloth and patted its side. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then, the foal jerked. Its back arched. And from deep within its throat, a faint whimper, like wind slipping through a keyhole, broke the silence. Elias dropped to his knees. Didn't speak. Just shut his eyes. And clenched his fists, like holding onto something that had just escaped death. The mare panted, but her eyes stayed open. Elias leaned in close and whispered in her ear. He's alive. You did it. But it wasn't over. The foal didn't nurse. Didn't seek the udder. Just lay there, trembling, breathing, but without instinct. Warden began to pace. A low growl echoed from his chest. Elias looked around. No milk replacer. No syringe. No warming lamp. Just a bottle of water. A few old towels. A plastic cup. And a newborn life, barely hanging on in a stable full of ash and memory. Elias warmed the water. Rubbed the foal's chest with a heated towel. He'd once learned how to revive a hypothermic soldier, rubbing pressure points, transferring body heat. Now he used every bit of that training. for a nameless soul. And then the foal shifted. Its legs trembled, but it pushed up. Unsteady, but trying. It fell, got up again, lowered its head, and found the direction. Toward the udder, now leaking with milk. For the first time in his life, Elias cried without knowing it. Tears fell into the towel in his hands. No one saw, and no one needed to. Warden stepped forward, rested his snout against Elias's thigh. Elias looked at the foal, then at Solen, then nodded slowly, as if completing some sacred, ancient rite no one had to witness. "I'm calling him male," Elias said. "It means light among the ruins." And strangely, as that name left his lips, the wind outside stopped. The sand no longer danced, and the sun began to rise beyond the distant ridge. Golden, gentle, warm. In that broken-down stable, a family had just been born. No blood ties, no papers, no one to certify it. Just 3 souls once discarded by the world, who chose, simply, to stay. 7 days since the birth, Male could now stand steady on his feet. Solen nibbled on dry hay, bit by bit, and Elias still hadn't slept through a single night. Not because of worry, but because, for the first time in 11 years, he was staying awake for something other than himself. The cabin was no longer a place of perfect silence. There was the soft clatter of the foal's hooves on straw, the gentle, rhythmic breathing of Solen, the quiet clink of a metal cup against the water trough, as Elias rinsed out cloths. And sometimes, there was a human voice, a voice telling stories. No one answered, but Elias kept talking. At first, just fragments. About how Warden once patrolled with him through Kandahar. About how he drinks his coffee black, because Clare used to say, a man shouldn't drink anything sweeter than the life he's lived. About the tree outside the cabin, where he once tied a rope, but couldn't bring himself to pull it tight. Solen didn't understand, but she stayed, didn't turn away, didn't resist. And for the first time, when Elias reached out and touched her cheek, she didn't flinch. She just closed her eyes, very slowly, as if to say yes, as if to say she forgave. Not Elias, but humanity. Warden lay at Elias's feet, eyes half shut, and Elias watched Male sleeping, his tiny body curled tightly against his mother's side, his chest rising and falling like autumn grass under a breeze. Elias reached under his shirt and pulled out an old necklace, the silver tarnished dark with time. The pendant held a photograph. A young girl, brown hair, dimpled cheeks, eyes too wide to know how cruel the world could be. Anna, he said, the first time he'd spoken her name in 11 years. If you're somewhere out there, and you can still hear your dad's voice, then know this. I'm placing you inside a new soul. Not to replace you, but to continue you. Because stopping is too easy. And you deserved better than easy. He slipped the chain from his neck, bent down, and placed it beside Male, right where the foal lay sleeping, like a charm, like the final period to a closed chapter, and the first letter of a new one. Solène looked at him. No words needed. No translation. Just an eye as deep as a canyon. And in that gaze, for the first time, Elias saw that he was no longer standing alone. And maybe, sometimes, language isn't in the words. Maybe it's in someone staying long enough to hear the things that can't be spoken aloud. Outside, the wind was still cold. But inside the wooden cabin, something had just begun to warm. Not by fire, but by silence. The kind shared only by those who had once fallen, but never truly left. It was the kind of afternoon that smelled both damp and dry. Strange, like the wind was changing its mind. Warden whined softly, standing near the door. He didn't bark, but he didn't take his eyes off the trail. Elias stepped outside. The sun slanted westward. Someone was coming. Not a wild animal. Not a lost traveler. But a person, walking quietly, deliberately, as if they knew exactly where they were going. She stopped in front of the cabin. A woman in her 30s, sun-worn face, calm as the earth, and eyes sharp as flint carved by centuries. You Elias Crane? He nodded. She didn't waste time. I'm Tala, daughter of Roy, the ranger who used to cover this region. I know Solène. The air inside the cabin changed instantly. Elias froze. Warden sat down. Solène, in the stall, lifted her head and let out a low, deep sound. Not fear. Recognition. Like something long lost had just returned. Tala's eyes stayed locked on Solène. That horse, she said, belongs to an ancient Mustang herd. They're called the Caligo, spirits of the drylands. They used to roam the borderlands around Keter Ridge Mine. Elias narrowed his eyes. Keter Mine? That was the abandoned silver mine, closed for 30 years. No one dared go near it. The earthquake back then split the land wide open. All that's left are collapsed shafts and whispered rumors. 4 months ago, Tala said, her voice raspy, I saw Solène with them. Then one day, I went back, and all I found were bloodstains and rope marks. Elias's hands clenched. His wrist trembled. Warden whimpered. Tala stepped closer, rested her hand on the stall fence. They're not all dead. I followed the scat trail, and I believe the herd's still alive. But they're trapped near the canyon by the west side of the mine. I found fresh tire tracks. Trash. Nylon wrappers. Blood, still wet. Poachers. They're waiting for the right moment to strike. Elias stood frozen. Mail was curled against his mother, but his head lifted. A hind leg stretched slowly, as if instinct itself felt the call of the herd. If you don't believe me, I get it, Tala said. But if Solène survived, maybe her herd is still waiting. The question is, who finds them first? Us, or the ones who plan to finish what they started? Elias turned back toward the cabin, reached for his old rifle, the wooden stock nicked and faded. He placed it on the table, said nothing, just breathed, and rested his hand on Mael's head for the very first time. They already lost their mother once. Not again. To the west of the cabin, the wind rose again. It carried dust and iron. The scent of blood. The scent of something coming from the other side of the line. Just before sunrise, the cabin remained dark, but in the stable, Male was already standing. No whinny, no movement, just still, as if he understood that today he would leave to shape his own fate. Elias sat motionless on the wooden chair. The old rifle lay in front of him. In his hand, a rusted combat knife. His eyes locked on a tin box, so worn, the engraved letters had faded away. He opened it. Inside were three things. A lock of his daughter's hair, braided with red thread. A broken piece of a military badge. A folded paper, yellowed and worn, with only one line left legible. If even one soul is still alive, let it not die like me. Warden lay under the table. The old dog didn't sleep. He knew. His warrior instinct whispered, "This mission wasn't one you come back from." Elias rose, slowly, slipped on his backpack, tucked the knife into his boot. For the first time in 11 years, he put on his military jacket. Not to fight, but to finish a war that never really ended. Tala waited by the fence. At her side, a handmade bow, a water gourd, the hand-drawn map, and eyes like living steel. "If you're not ready for what you'll see out there, then you'd better not go." Elias didn't reply. He simply raised his hand and slid the lock of his daughter's hair between the leather pads on Male's saddle. "I won't let either of them die again. Not the child inside me, and not the herd that's hers." They set out. Red Hollow Desert welcomed no one with a heart. It ground guilt into hot sand. It made you chew on your memories like raw meat still frozen at the center. The wind cut in bursts. Sand whipped their faces like a grinding wheel. Jagged rocks bloodied Male's hooves. Tala tore off a strip of her shirt, wrapped it around the colt's foot. Without saying a word, Warden clawed at the stone. He found it. A drag mark still fresh, with the tire print of a shipping container. Elias walked last, every step dragging behind him the ghost of who he was 11 years ago. The man who had fired into the sky, desperate for an evac. But the radio was dead. No one came. His daughter died on a hospital screen. He lived, but the part of him worth living never came back. Suddenly, Male froze. Ears tilted toward a slit in the rocks. He let out a whinny. Soft, but it carried. And from deep within the canyon, a voice answered. Another whinny, rough, broken, like the last breath of a soul left behind. Tala looked up. That's Caligo. They're still alive, but they're trapped in the stone, and someone's waiting for nightfall to use a silencer. Elias drew his knife, his voice low, steady. No one dies in silence. Not anymore. The wind stopped. Not a sound. And in that unnatural stillness, Elias looked up. A glint from a ridge. A scope, reflecting sunlight like a steel blade. Watching them, then gone. Warden howled. Tala pulled an arrow from her quiver. Elias tightened his grip on the knife. Male stepped forward, shielding his mother. No way back. No third party. No other choice. And in that moment, Elias Crane died a second time. so he could come back as something more than a soldier, more than a shadow, a man in the truest sense. Behind them, the wooden cabin remained, a temporary grave, a place to bury the past. Ahead, the dead mine, a place not everyone enters, and even fewer ever leave, with anything left to bring back. Late afternoon. The sunlight no longer poured, it hung, suspended above the jagged rocks like blades waiting to drop. Male walked slowly, tired, but not giving up. Warden kept close to Elias, tail still, back arched, a bowstring ready to snap. Ahead lay the entrance to the stone ravine near Kettermine, where Elias believed the Caligo herd was trapped. But something else was waiting first. 3 men stood between the rocks. No armor, no masks, just dusty khaki shirts, cowboy hats, and AR-15s slung low across their shoulders. The man in the center was tall, sunburned, a green paracord bracelet on his left wrist, the kind only special ops veterans wear when they've lived through hell. Elias stopped cold. His eyes narrowed, like trying to tear through old memories. Tala drew her bow. Warden growled low. "In a long time," the man said, his voice gravelly, scorched. So familiar Elias nearly gagged. "Heard you didn't die after all." Looks like that was true. Cole Maddox, Survival Sergeant, Bravo 7 Unit. The man who pulled Elias from the IED blast in Helmand. The one who dragged their buddy's body out of the rubble. The one who shared the last half of a lucky strike in a sandpit in Iraq. And now, commander of a wild horse hunting crew, selling souls by the pound. Elias didn't reach for his gun. He just stood there, tall, steady, and asked, voice like cold steel, "What the hell are you doing here?" Cole shrugged, gestured behind him. A few containers, steel cages, a herd of horses, blindfolded, legs bound. Solen wasn't among them, but Elias saw the blood streak down the back of a foal. "Making a living," Cole said. "Same as you used to. Difference is, I lived longer." The silence that followed was so thick. Even a falling pebble would have sounded like a gunshot. Male whinnied softly, hiding behind Elias's leg. Tala stared at Cole like her arrow was already halfway through his skull. Warden crept forward, growl rising from his chest. "You used to save people," Elias said slowly. "Now you kill the voiceless, for cash?" The Caligo aren't just horses. They're the spirit of this land. And you're slicing the throat of the very place that once shielded your back from bullets. Cole chuckled. A broken, crooked laugh. Not joyful. Not bitter. Just hollow. Bullets, I survived. But the death inside you and me. You know it, Elias. It's faster than any round ever fired. They stared at each other. No words. No blinking. Just Elias's hand brushing the rifle grip. And Cole slowly chambering around. Not raising the gun. Just loading it. A statement that needed no explanation. "Step back, Elias. You can walk away. With the horse. The dog. Your life. The rest of them, not your business." Tala's voice cut sharp. "You're wrong. To him, any soul that breathes is his business. Silence returned. No one fired. No one spoke. But the click of metal within rifles echoed like a countdown. And in that moment, Elias knew. If he pulled the trigger, he wouldn't just kill Cole. He'd kill the last sliver of humanity left in either of them. Then, a whinny pierced the stillness. Not male. Not the bound herd. But from within the ravine, a wild horse, still free. Still alive. Still Caligo. A soul unbroken. What will Elias do? Pull the trigger to stop what's coming? Or descend deeper into the mind to save what still breathes, knowing that behind Cole, something even darker awaits? Night. A full moon hovered in the sky, like the ancient eye of the universe, watching silently. Solen lay still, her breathing now steady. Warden gently licked her leg, not out of affection, but because he knew. Tonight, there was no need to growl. Maddox turned his horse, said nothing, left his rifle behind, resting atop a flat stone. Tala picked it up, not to keep it, but to bury it, with her own hands, beneath the earth. The next morning, Elias opened the stable door. No commands, no whistles, just placed his hand on the reins and unfastened them. Solen rose, trembling slightly, but her eyes were clear. And Male, without waiting, let out a whinny, long and fierce, then bolted forward to lead the herd. Elias guided them to the last place he still trusted in his memory. Camp Echo, an old military recovery post for war horses, abandoned since 1976. It was there he once saw a horse named Bravo rescued, when both its leg and spirit were broken. And it was also there. At 8 years old, Elias had asked his father, "If a horse can't fight anymore, do we leave it behind?" And his father had only said, "A horse doesn't need to fight. It just needs to know how to stand." Now, Solen stood, right there, by a shattered water trough, inside a fence half fallen to time. But her eyes, they shone like a soul that had crossed through war and chosen to live. The sky turned gold. The herd began to move north, toward the low hills where wild forests still grew. Solen stood last. She didn't leave right away. She turned back, looked at Elias, long, unblinking, not to say goodbye, not to thank him, but as if to ask one last question. "Will you be all right if I go?" Elias didn't answer, didn't speak. He simply placed his hand over his chest, where a necklace had hung for over a decade. Nothing remained around his neck now, but inside, something heavier lived there. Solen lowered her head, slowly, then turned. She didn't run. She walked, step by step, as if guiding his spirit back into the earth. Male stayed in front, didn't look back, didn't need to, because Elias knew. He had found where he belonged. Night fell. Elias returned to the cabin. Warden followed behind, not growling, but not tucking his tail either. Tala took the mountain trail, back to her village. No promises to meet again, no farewells. The cabin looked the same. The door still sagged on its hinges. The floor still creaked in places. But for the first time in 11 years, Elias didn't turn on the light. He just sat down, exhaled, and let silence fill the space. He pulled an old folded paper from his pocket. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear enough in his mind. Not all wounds need healing. Some scars only need to be accepted. When a soul chooses to believe in you, the only thing you owe it is to not betray that belief. Elias folded the paper back, placed it in the desk drawer, then closed his eyes, and for the first time, slept without seeing blood. That night, a sound echoed faintly from the mountain ridge. Unclear, not loud, but it sounded like the whinny of a young horse. A call, returning from the place where the light had once been buried. Not everyone who falls needs to be caught. Some souls only need a single look to rise one last time. Solen never spoke. Male never had a name to call. And yet, it was those two lost, wild souls who pulled a broken man back from hell. Not with miracles, not with redemption, but with a raw and brutal truth. The world will crush you unless you dare to step forward and choose to stay. Elias didn't save a horse. He saved the part of himself he once buried alive. And if you've ever thought, I've got no one, nothing left holding me here, then please, don't let go just yet. Maybe, somewhere out there, a soul is waiting for you. Not to be rescued, but to give you a reason not to collapse. If you're still breathing, you still have the right to choose. To wait for death, or to become the reason someone else doesn't die alone. If this story made your heart go quiet for a moment, share it. Not to cry together, but so that someone lost in the storm of life will know this. Sometimes it's the wild, nameless souls that remind us what it truly means to be human. If you believe that too, leave a single period symbol in the comments, so we'll know someone out there is still willing to stay together.